In 15 years of fly fishing, I've managed to pick up a few tips that make the fishing experience in general more enjoyable, catch more fish, and have less issues in general. In this video, I'm going to break down some of these tips as easily as I can. I had a few comments in the last video that was some how-tos on some different methods, and in this video I'm going to try and cover those questions. But more widely, if you're a beginner getting into fly fishing, this video should help a lot. So I'm going to break this video up into 3 sections. The first is trout behaviour in general and approach in fly fishing. Then the tackle to try and deal with that trout behaviour. And finally, how to use the tackle. That's it. This might not be amazing if you're already advanced, but I think it might be kind of interesting. And please tell me if there's any tips that you think that would actually help me, because every day's a school day. There's never been a time that I've gone out fly fishing and not learned something. Every time I go out, I learn something new. So please let me know in the comments if there's anything else you'd like to add into what I'm saying here to try and help beginners out. But let's get started. So number 1 is trout's behaviour, and that's trout across all species, rainbow trout, brown trout, whether they're wild or stocked. Trout are very aggressive, extremely aggressive predators.
Yeah. Oh, I take that one.
And their main prey, in the wild at least, is insects. From pupae, all the way up to larvae, all the way up to hatching flies. Flies that are actually emerging out of the water and hatching. Those adults are ones that we can see above the water, but the entire time that the fish are under the water, they're feeding in the water column, whether it be a river or a loch or a lake. Trout feed throughout the day, but there are periods where they will start to feed more and start to feed less. And they are generally towards the start of the day, in the very early periods, trout will have an innate behavioural response to feed as flies are hatching off. So flies hatch more regularly in the early hours of the day and at dusk. So dawn and dusk are 2 very active times for wild fish, but also for stocked fish as well. A lot of people think that stocked fishing isn't really fishing. In my opinion, stocked fishing is just a completely different type of mentality when coming to the water. You're not trying to suss out how to catch wild fish. It's more how to get aggressive reactions or actually keep up with the fish as they develop in the water. Because when a fish is freshly stocked, its behaviour is unknown to itself. It is stocked into a water body that it's never been in before, and it has to learn what is food in this area. Now we can take advantage of that as they're freshly stocked and put extremely bright lures in front of their face, and that'll actually get an aggressive reaction out of them. So now that's something that's quite fun, and some of the methods that I mentioned about last video, with the bung and with pulling, these actually exploit fish that are still working out their environment. They're trying to figure out what is food, what they can eat. So they don't have hands. Fish don't have hands to test flies out, to test things that are in the water out. So they'll mouth it. They'll use their mouth, and we can use that and their aggression to try and get takes. And I find that extremely fun. A lot of people like to stick to the wild fishing, which is great. Wild fishing's amazing fun. But stocked fishing, there's an awful lot of fun to be had there as well. And we can't do wild fishing all year round, so it gets a few of us by in the winter. Now, coming on to the second thing, after trout behaviour, because that's quite wild. We could talk about trout behaviour for ages, but as a base, you want to know, starting to come into fly fishing, that we are targeting feeding fish, and whether they're feeding on something that even they don't know what it is, or targeting a specific fly that they're feeding on. That'll explain a little bit more about why we use certain methods when we're fly fishing. So the kit that we're going to use, I've got some basic kit behind me here. We're just going to run through it. The first thing is your rod. Now, I've only got the base section of one of my rods here because I'd be flying around a 10-foot rod here. Your rod is the staple of every fishing trip. This will never change. You'll always use a rod. Now, some numbers get thrown around that if you're a beginner, you might not understand what that means. So you'll see here that on this, hopefully the camera will catch it. There we go. So this is a 10-foot 7-weight line. They're the only 2 numbers that you really need to know. The length of your rod, which for this is 10 foot, and it deals with a 7-weight line. 7-weight line just simply refers to its capability and how powerful effectively it is. Now you can have very powerful low weight rods, but it just means you're able to handle bigger fish more easily with a 7-weight rod. It's more powerful. Now if you're going for smaller fish, it's more fun generally, and you can be more dainty with lighter weight rods. So quite often I like to use 4 and 3-weight rods for wild brown trout, and for bigger fish, 7-weight rod kind of covers all your bases. But that's what that means effectively. Now 10 foot refers to the length of the rod. The longer your rod, the longer you'll be able to cast. So if you're at a fishery that requires you to put out a decent amount of line, you'll be able to do that with a 10-foot rod. Now you can cast far with shorter rods, it's just a lot easier with a 10-foot rod. And that's all that really comes down to, is personal preference after that, whether you want to go 6-weight, 5-weight for more fun. That's one of the things that you can choose coming into this, but that's the general drift behind rods. Second, you then have to put your reel and your line on the rod. And they come in many different shapes and sizes. However, the only thing you need to know here is that you're going to carry forward that weight of line. So you saw there that was a 7-weight rod. All we need now is a 7-weight reel and a 7-weight line that can match that rod. That's the only thing we need to know. This is a slow sinking line that you've seen me use in many cases, and one of my favorite lines for pulling is a slow intermediate called a fast glass. Now, slow intermediate simply means that when the line hits the surface of the water, it starts to immediately slowly sink. So that line will be getting pulled back to you under the water as opposed to floating on top of the water, which is what a floating line means. Now, this reel is a reel that I can change lines on. So this doesn't just have one line that's always on it. I can undo this reel, bring that out, and it comes apart. And now I can actually take out that cassette and swap out this for another line. If I wanted to fish a midge tip, then I could get that cassette and I could plug that back in. And you'll see now that this reel functions entirely on its own. This is not just for that one line, which is super handy and something I would highly recommend if you're starting out fishing. Now, to link this equipment section back into the trout behavior, this is where lines start to match what trout behavior is happening. So when we're pulling or we're trying to get an aggressive reaction from fish, I often like to use sinking lines. And that's because you can pull flies back very fast in the water without having any disturbance on the top of the water from a floating line or a midge tip. Now that doesn't mean you can't pull, it's just a personal preference, and where we start to use lines to help us navigate that trout behavior. So if a fish is feeding naturally on the top of the water, eating flies that are on top, those adults that we would call dry flies, we would then target that with dry flies. And that comes on nicely to the last bit of kit that we're going to talk about right now, and that's flies and fly boxes. You'll need, if you're starting out, some sort of fly box. Now this is quite a big fly box that I've been working on. I have my fly tying space behind me here, so I thought I'd just grab this. And I have been tying buzzers. So you can see here that I have some pretty natural looking flies here that are all imitations of pupae under the water that we would call buzzers. So these are the larval stages that I'm trying to target with these flies. Now you can fish these on anything from a floating line to a midge tip to under the bung, but that's a perfect example of how a fly is directly targeting a trout behavior that we're trying to replicate. And one of the best bits about fly fishing really is trying to suss out, create the puzzle and work out the puzzle of what fish are actively feeding on, which is great fun, the whole part of it. Lastly, how to fish with this equipment. So I think it would be handy to probably have a full breakdown of individual methods in separate videos, but what I'm going to try and do here is summarize the entirety of how we use methods, individual methods. And by that, I'm going to try and explain that simply. So, this is a good example, continuing on from the buzzers there. In the water column, what we are trying to replicate is how those would move in reality as they are emerging. So, these buzzers here, in the water column, they would hatch at the bottom and slowly rise to the surface. They have a small gas bubble that's basically in the back of their wing case that allows them to slowly rise to the top. Now, if we were to fish these buzzers quite fast, fish that are already feeding on buzzers would look at those buzzers that are moving fast, our flies, and simply brush past them because they're not moving in the same pattern that the rest of the larvae in the water are moving. So we want to try and copy, as best we can, the natural pattern of how those trout are behaving. So if they're sipping through the water, picking up buzzers that are moving very slowly, we want to try and replicate that slow moving buzzer as best we can. Now we can do that in a lot of ways. If you fish a floating line and you cast out and you let those buzzers just sit there and you slowly bring them back in, you can actually imitate those buzzers rising to the top. Or you can fish the likes of a bung and have buzzers at set depths, which then you cast out and you can leave them, slowly pull the bung back and it will rise them up and lower them down. That's another way that you can fish that. A third way, put a floating fly like a fab at the front of the cast and have two buzzers behind it, and then you're fishing two buzzers much higher up in the water column, but you still have full control over how quickly you bring them back. They are three examples of a specific fly, but the general gist is we're trying to imitate how the trout are behaving. We're trying to imitate that feed that the trout are actively feeding on. So if it's buzzers, it's slow. If it's fry patterns, say you have wild brown trout that are smashing into some fry, and that fry are small fish for anyone that doesn't know, those baby fish, they're often sticklebacks or minnows. They're at the side, very tight into most banks. If they are smashing into pods of fry and those fry are scattering around really quickly, we actually want to fish our flies pretty fast, pretty quickly to imitate those small fish, or getting an aggressive reaction out of fish by fishing them slow and then quickly. So if you can try and approach a water in such a way that you're either going for aggressive reactions with lures that isn't imitating anything real or insect-like, or if you're trying to imitate something the trout feed on naturally, think about how that might move in the water column and try and put that into practice. That's probably the easiest, simplest way to put across how easy it can be to just approach a water and try something. It doesn't have to be super complicated. It can be as easy and as simple as you want it to be. Now, if you're not catching fish on any one set method, it might just be that those fish aren't feeding on that type of fly that you're fishing. So then that's when we would change. Now, something that might help out is, where can you get some stuff like this? Well, recently I was through chatting to the lovely couple that run My Fishing Flies, and I'll put some stuff in here for them. They have everything you could ever want for fly tying, fly fishing. You could go in there and you could get your full setup other than a rod and you'd be good to go. They're in Grangemouth, they're absolutely great, and they're also more than willing to help you out with any of the theory. If you have questions around fly fishing, they're an absolutely great couple, Dale and Tracy. So please go and have a look there if you're ever in the Central Belt and you're looking for a fly fishing specific shop. Thanks very much for watching. And if you have any questions, pop them in the comments below. I'll catch you in the next video. Cheerio.